Is this some kind of joke?" The voice, slick with polish and privilege, cut through the polite murmur of the reception hall. It belonged to General Markson, a man whose 4 stars seemed to glitter with their own self-importance. He gestured with a half-empty champagne flute towards the man standing quietly by the window, a man who seemed as out of place in the grand, oak-paneled room as a fieldstone in a jewelry box. "I mean, look at him. Is that what we're letting in to see our finest graduate these days?" The small circle of decorated officers around Markson chuckled, a sycophantic sound that grated on the ear. The man in question, Jack Callahan, didn't react. He stood with a stillness that was almost unnatural, his gaze fixed on the parade ground outside where cadets were forming up for the graduation ceremony. His son, Daniel, was out there, 3rd from the left in the front rank. That was all that mattered. The general's words were just noise, like the distant hum of traffic easily ignored when your focus was absolute. Jack's tweed jacket was worn at the elbows, a faint scent of cedar and old leather clinging to it. His jeans were clean but faded, and his work boots, though polished for the occasion, bore the deep scuffs and scars of a life lived on his feet. He looked like a groundskeeper, or maybe a small-town carpenter who'd driven a long way to see his boy make good. In this room of razor-creased uniforms and shimmering metals, he was an anomaly, a disruption in the carefully curated image of military prestige. The general, clearly enjoying his audience, took a step closer to Jack. He was a performer, and he'd found his prop. "You know, it takes a certain breed to make it through this place," Markson pontificated, his voice loud enough for everyone in their little cluster to hear. "A cut above, men forged in fire, tested in the crucible. It's not for everyone." He looked Jack up and down, a theatrical sweep of his eyes that was meant to dismiss and diminish. "You have a son graduating today, I take it?" Jack finally turned his head, his eyes, a startlingly clear blue in his weathered face, meeting the general's. They held no anger, no fear, no shame. They were just calm, a deep, unsettling calm, like the surface of the ocean before a storm. "Yes, sir. My son. Daniel." His voice was quiet, with a rough, gravelly texture, the kind of voice that didn't waste words. The general smirked, mistaking quiet for weakness. "Daniel Callahan. Good name. Strong name. I'm sure you're very proud. It must be something else for a man like you to see your son achieve this, to join a world you've only seen on television." The insult was cloaked in a thin veneer of condescension, but it was as sharp as a bayonet. The other officers shifted uncomfortably. This was going too far, even for Markson, but no one dared to correct a 4-star general in his element. Jack's posture didn't change. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I'm very proud of him," he repeated, his focus already drifting back towards the window, towards his son. He wasn't playing the general's game. He was in a different world entirely, one where the pomp and ceremony of this room were irrelevant. His world was defined by different metrics: mission success, the safety of his team, the promise he'd made to his wife on her deathbed that he would see their boy grow into a good man. He had kept that promise. Today was the culmination of it. A general's ego was a minor inconvenience, a gnat buzzing around his head. He'd endured interrogations in languages he didn't speak, in rooms without light for days on end. He'd held the line against overwhelming odds with nothing but the man on his left and the man on his right. The barbs of a preening officer were less than nothing. He could stand here all day and let the man talk, because in an hour he would get to pin the gold bars on his son's collar and the universe would be perfectly in balance. This understanding, this deep well of patience forged in unimaginable hardship, was his armor. It was invisible, and to men like Markson, incomprehensible. The general saw a worn-out civilian. He couldn't see the fortress of will that stood behind the quiet eyes. Across the room, leaning against a marble pillar, stood Major Kent. He was an aide to a visiting dignitary, and he had an unobstructed view of the unfolding drama. Kent was a career intelligence officer, a man trained to see what others missed, to read the tells, to understand the patterns beneath the surface. He watched General Markson, a man he privately considered a peacetime general, all bluster and politics, and felt a familiar professional disgust. Then his eyes settled on the civilian, the target of the general's scorn. At first, he saw what everyone else saw, a simple man, out of his depth. But Kent kept watching, and the more he watched, the more a cold knot of unease began to form in his stomach. It was the man's stance. It wasn't the slouch of a laborer or the fidgeting of a nervous parent. It was a perfect state of relaxed readiness. His feet were shoulder-width apart, his weight balanced. His hands were loose at his sides, not jammed in his pockets. It was the posture of a man who could move with explosive speed from a state of complete rest. It was a shooter's stance, a breacher's stance. Kent had seen that same eerie stillness once before, in grainy drone footage from a night raid in the Hindu Kush Mountains. He shook his head slightly, trying to clear it. It was a coincidence. Just a man standing. But Kent couldn't look away. The civilian, Callahan, turned his head slightly to check the window again, and the light from the tall, arched window caught a faint, silvery line of scar tissue that ran from his temple into his hairline. It was an old wound, but clean, the kind left by a fast-moving piece of shrapnel. Then, as Callahan briefly raised a hand to rub the back of his neck, his jacket cuff pulled back just an inch. For less than a second, a piece of ink was visible on the inside of his wrist. It was faded, the lines blurred by sun and time, but Kent's blood ran cold. He recognized it instantly. It wasn't a standard military tattoo. It was a small, cryptic symbol, a sigil known only in the deepest, most classified corners of the Special Operations community. It was a marker, a tribe signifier for a unit that officially didn't exist. A unit spoken of only in whispers, its members referred to not by name, but by legend. Kent's mind began to race, flipping through classified files he'd read years ago, connecting the dots with a terrifying speed. The stance, the scar, the tattoo, the impossible calm under the fire of a four-star general's ego. It couldn't be. The man was a ghost, a myth from the early days of the war. They called him Wraith. He was supposed to be dead or retired to some forgotten corner of the country. The general, completely oblivious and fueled by Jack's continued silence, decided to go for the kill. He wanted a reaction, a flinch, anything to prove his dominance. He clapped a heavy hand on Jack's shoulder, a gesture of false camaraderie that was deeply insulting. "So, tell me, Callahan," he said, his voice booming with mock sincerity. "You ever think of putting on a uniform yourself? Or was stocking shelves at the local market more your speed? No shame in it. Someone's got to do it, right? Keep the home front running while the real men are out there on the wall." The joke, if it could be called that, landed with a thud. The air grew thick with a new kind of silence, one of acute embarrassment. The other officers looked at their shoes, at the ceiling, anywhere but at the quiet man being publicly humiliated. They were ashamed, not for Jack, but of their commanding officer. This was beyond the pale. It was cruel. It was a gross abuse of his rank and position. Jack's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened, the calm surface of the water freezing over into a sheet of ice. He was still looking out the window, but he wasn't seeing the parade ground anymore. For a fleeting moment, he was seeing the dust of Kandahar, hearing the chop of rotor blades, feeling the weight of his gear and the heavier weight of responsibility for the lives of the men around him. He could smell the cordite and the fear. "Sir?" The voice was sharp, respectful, but charged with an authority that had nothing to do with the single gold oak leaf on the speaker's shoulder. Major Kent had pushed himself off the pillar and crossed the space in 3 long, purposeful strides. He came to a halt beside the general, but he wasn't looking at him. He was looking at Jack Callahan, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. General Markson turned, annoyed at the interruption. "What is it, Major? Can't you see? I'm having a conversation with this citizen?" Kent ignored him. He kept his gaze locked on Jack. "Forgive me for staring, sir," Kent said, his voice now lower, more intimate, directed only at Jack. "I was a watch officer at Bagram 2009. Operation Serpent's Tooth, I was on the ISR feed. I heard your voice on the net." Jack's eyes shifted from the window, and for the first time, they truly focused on someone in the room. He looked at the Major, a flicker of recognition or perhaps just acknowledgement in their depths. The ice began to thaw, replaced by that deep, weary patience. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. That was all the confirmation Kent needed. He straightened his back, took a deep breath, and turned to face General Markson. The general's face was a mask of confusion and irritation. "What in God's name are you talking about, Kent?" "General, with all due respect, you need to stop talking. Right now," Kent stated, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. The room, which had already been quiet, became utterly still. You could hear the frantic pounding of Kent's own heart. He was a major, publicly and directly contradicting a 4-star general. It was career suicide. But it didn't matter. Some things were more important. "Sir," Kent said, his voice dropping into a formal, almost reverent tone, "you are not speaking to a civilian. You are addressing Master Chief Petty Officer Jack Callahan, United States Navy." The name and rank hung in the air. A Master Chief. A senior, non-commissioned officer. Respected, yes, but not someone a 4-star general would defer to. Markson scoffed. "A Master Chief? And what of it? I've forgotten more Master Chiefs than you've ever met, Major." But Kent wasn't finished. He held up a hand. "Sir, he is not just any Master Chief. He was the senior enlisted leader for Naval Special Warfare Development Group. You may have heard of them by another name." The silence that followed was deafening. DevGru, SEAL Team 6, the quiet professionals, the legends, the men who did the nation's most dangerous work in total anonymity. The color began to drain from General Markson's face as the implications crashed down on him. The other officers stood frozen, their mouths slightly agape. They were looking at Jack Callahan now, but they were seeing something else entirely. They were seeing a ghost. Kent's voice was the only sound in the room, a steady, measured cadence listing a litany of impossible deeds. Master Chief Callahan was the ground commander on Serpent's Tooth. He led the team that recovered the intel from Compound Alpha 7. He was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions during the embassy siege in 2012, an award that remains classified to this day. He has 3 Silver Stars, 5 Bronze Stars with Valor, and 4 Purple Hearts. His entire operational record is sealed at the highest level of classification, but I can assure you, sir, he has spent more time in combat than everyone else in this room combined. He didn't stock shelves. He hunted the men who want to burn our world to the ground, and he did it in silence, without recognition, for 30 years. He is, without exaggeration, a living legend in the community. Every word was a hammer blow to General Markson's pride, shattering his arrogance into a million pieces. He stared at Jack, at the worn jacket and the calm eyes, and he finally saw him. He saw the weight of the years, the cost of the sacrifice. He saw the quiet, unbreakable dignity of a man who had walked through hell and come back, not for medals or for glory, but for the man next to him. Markson's face, which had been red with bluster, was now pale with a deep and profound shame. He had used this man, this warrior, as a punchline. He felt sick. He took a shaky breath, and then he did the only thing he could. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight. His movements were sharp, precise, all the arrogance burned away, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming humility. In the dead, silent room, he snapped his hand up in a perfect formal salute. The sight was stunning. A 4-star general, one of the most powerful men in the United States military, rendering a salute to a quietly dressed man in a worn tweed jacket. It was a complete and total inversion of the established order, a public act of apology and profound respect that went far beyond words. The salute was held, crisp and unwavering, an admission of his colossal error in judgment. Jack Callahan looked at the general, holding the man's gaze for a long moment. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply gave that same, small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. It was a gesture of grace, an acceptance of the apology. It was absolution. Slowly, General Markson lowered his hand. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could he say? He just shook his head, the shame still etched on his face, and stepped back, melting into the circle of stunned officers. The confrontation was over. Just then, a young cadet with a shock of sandy hair and his father's clear blue eyes entered the room. "Dad?" Daniel Callahan said, his new second lieutenant's bar gleaming on his uniform collar. "They're about to start. Are you ready?" Jack's face broke into a warm, genuine smile. All the ice, all the weariness, vanished. "Right behind you, son," he said, his voice full of a pride that had nothing to do with rank or medals. He placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, and together the father and son walked out of the room, leaving behind a group of powerful men who had just been taught a brutal lesson about the nature of true strength and the quiet heroism that walks unseen among them.